He leaned across the folding table in the bridal suite, his knuckles white against the wood. His voice was sharp enough to cut through the sounds of laughter filtering in from the garden. "This ceremony is over. You will not marry my son today." The air smelled like hairspray and roses. My hands were shaking so badly I had to hide them in my bouquet. Outside, 150 guests were already seated. The string quartet was warming up. The cake was ready. And here was Richard, the groom's father, tearing my wedding apart in front of the venue coordinator and makeup artist who suddenly wouldn't look at me. I felt heat rush up my neck. Don't panic yet. Something colder, something harder. Rage, the kind that doesn't explode. The kind that calculates. He spoke to me like I was a misbehaving employee, not a bride. "You embarrassed this family enough. I won't allow you to humiliate my son further by pretending this is appropriate." His words were clipped, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror. The makeup artist packed her brushes without a word. The coordinator looked at her tablet, suddenly very interested in the schedule. I stood there in my white dress, pins still holding the veil in place, feeling everyone watching. Not just the staff in the room. I could feel the weight of every guest outside, every family member who would hear about this, every friend who would ask what happened. Richard adjusted his cufflinks like this was a business transaction he'd just closed. Efficient, final, done. My brain was screaming. My chest was tight, but I didn't move, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. Instead, something clicked into place. A voice in my head that sounded like my old boss from the law firm where I worked as a paralegal. She used to say, "When someone shows you who they are in public, they're giving you ammunition. Don't waste it by reacting, document everything." So I stood there, bouquet trembling in my hands, and I watched him. I memorized every word, every dismissive gesture. Every witness in the room. I forced my face into something neutral and said, "I understand." Richard blinked. He expected tears. He expected me to crumble. Instead, I nodded once and watched him leave. The door clicked shut. The makeup artist whispered, "I'm so sorry." I didn't answer. I was already planning. "My name is Rosie. I'm 28 years old. I grew up in a small apartment with a single mother who taught me that survival isn't about being the loudest. It's about being the smartest. I worked my way through college doing night shifts at a diner, graduated with honors, and landed a job at a corporate law firm. I wasn't a lawyer. I was a paralegal. But I learned something more valuable than case law. I learned how power actually works. It's not about shouting. It's about paperwork. Contracts, timelines, documentation. I learned that the people who control the narrative aren't the ones who scream the loudest. They're the ones who keep the receipts. And when Richard walked into that bridal suite and tried to humiliate me, he made one critical mistake. He assumed I didn't know how to fight back. The reason Richard gave was vague and cruel. "You don't come from the right background. You'll drag him down. This marriage is a mistake, and I'm correcting it before it's too late." He said it like it was a fact. Like my worth was something he could calculate on a spreadsheet and determine insufficient. He didn't mention my job. He didn't mention my education. He mentioned my mother's job as a housekeeper. He mentioned the neighborhood I grew up in. He mentioned that I didn't have family money or connections. He said these things in front of people who worked for the venue, people who had no reason to be involved in this humiliation. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't about protecting his son. This was about control. This was about making sure I knew my place. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to leave quietly so he could tell everyone I wasn't good enough. He wanted to win. My fiancé, Daniel, was supposed to be getting ready in the groom's suite, but he wasn't there. He was standing outside the bridal suite door. I heard his voice through the wood. Quiet, strained. "Dad, please, not today." Richard's response was sharp. "Especially today, before this becomes legal." There was a pause, a long, painful silence. And then I heard Daniel say, "I'll talk to her." Not "I'll stop you." Not "this is wrong." Just "I'll talk to her." Like I was a problem to be managed. Like his father's cruelty was something we could negotiate around. When Daniel finally knocked and came in, his eyes were red. He looked torn, guilty, but he didn't look angry. He looked scared. Scared of his father. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about today. This was about the rest of my life. If I married into this family without standing up now, I would be fighting this battle forever. After the guests were told there was a delay, after the whispers started, after the coordinator asked if we were rescheduling or canceling, the room emptied. The chairs outside sat in perfect rows. The flowers were wilting slightly in the heat. The cake was sweating under its fondant. and I was standing in the bridal suite alone, still in my dress, staring at my reflection. My makeup was perfect. My hair was perfect. Everything was ready except the ceremony. I took off the veil. I sat down on the floor, not caring about the dress anymore, and I let myself feel it. The humiliation, the anger, the betrayal, not just from Richard, from Daniel too. Because he chose silence when I needed him to choose me. I sat there for 20 minutes, then I stood up. I called my best friend, Maya, and I said, I need your car, and I need you to not ask questions yet. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I wrote down everything. Every word Richard said, the time he arrived, the names of the people in the room, the way he adjusted his cufflinks like he was bored, the way Daniel hesitated. I wrote it all down. Then I opened my laptop. I pulled up the contract I'd signed with the venue. I read every line. I checked the payment records. The deposit had come from Daniel's account, but the final payment had come from Richard's. That was interesting. Then I pulled up the emails between me, Daniel, and the wedding planner. I read through them carefully, looking for anything, any moment where Richard had inserted himself, any moment where control had shifted, and I found it, 3 weeks ago, an email from Richard to the planner, CCing Daniel. Please route all final decisions through me. I'm handling the budget. I thought about my old boss, Margaret. She was a senior partner at the firm, and she didn't get there by being nice. She got there by being precise. I once watched her dismantle a CEO's credibility in a deposition. She didn't yell. She didn't insult him. She just asked questions. Simple. Polite questions, and with each answer he dug himself deeper. By the end, he'd contradicted himself 4 times, and the case was over. She taught me that power collapses when it's exposed, not with drama, with facts. After the deposition, I asked her how she stayed so calm. She said, because I know something he doesn't. I've already won. I'm just walking him through the realization. That's what I needed to do now. I needed to stop reacting and start moving. Richard thought he'd ended this. He thought I'd slink away, humiliated and silent. He had no idea I was just getting started. The next morning, I called the venue. I didn't call the coordinator, I called the owner directly. I'd met her once during the walkthrough. Her name was Patricia. I kept my voice calm and professional. Hi, Patricia, this is Rosie. I wanted to follow up on yesterday's situation. I know it was unusual and I wanted to clarify something for the record. Patricia sighed. I'm so sorry that happened. That must have been awful. I didn't take the bait. I didn't vent. I just said, can you tell me who has the authority to cancel the event, according to the contract? There was a pause. Well, the contract is under Daniel's name, so technically he's the only one who can cancel. Not his father. No, why? I smiled. Just confirming, thank you. I hung up. Richard had no legal authority to cancel my wedding. He just bullied his way into that room and hoped no one would question him. That was mistake number 1. I spent the next 2 days reading. Not novels, not distractions. I read contracts. I read the venue agreement. I read the vendor agreements. I read the payment receipts, and I noticed something. Richard's name was on a lot of payments, but not on the actual contracts. The contracts were in Daniel's name. Legally, this wedding belonged to Daniel and me, not Richard, but Richard had been acting like he owned it. Why? Because he'd paid for it, and in his world, money equals control. But legally, money doesn't mean anything if your name isn't on the contract. I pulled up the email thread again. I found the message where Richard told the planner to route decisions through him. I forwarded it to myself. Then I opened a new document. I titled it Timeline of Events. And I started building my case. Not for court, not yet, but for leverage, because I was starting to realize something. Richard wasn't just controlling, he was sloppy, and sloppy people leave trails. I requested a meeting, not with Richard, with Daniel. I kept it polite, professional. I said, we need to talk about what happened. I'd like to understand your father's concerns. Daniel looked relieved, like I was finally being reasonable. We met at a coffee shop. Neutral ground, he apologized. He said his father was just protective. He said it got out of hand. He said he still wanted to marry me. I listened. I nodded. Then I said, I need to understand something. Does your father have a history of doing this? Daniel blinked. Doing what? Interfering in major decisions, controlling outcomes, making people feel small. He shifted in his seat. He's just intense. Has he done this to other people you've dated? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Then quietly, yes. I took a sip of my coffee. What happened to them? They left. Why? Because he made it impossible. I nodded. Thank you for being honest. Daniel looked hopeful. So we're okay. I smiled. We'll see. I started asking questions, quietly, carefully. I reached out to Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Lauren. I found her on social media. I sent a message. Hi, I know this is strange, but I'm engaged to Daniel. His father interrupted our wedding. I'm trying to understand if this is a pattern. She responded within an hour. Oh my God, yes, call me. We talked for 2 hours. She told me everything. How Richard had sabotaged her job interview at a company where he had connections. How he'd told Daniel she was using him for money. How he'd shown up at her apartment unannounced and told her to leave his son alone. She said, he doesn't see women as people. He sees them as threats to his control over Daniel. I asked, did you ever fight back? She laughed bitterly. I tried. He threatened to sue me for defamation. I didn't have the money to fight him, so I left. I thanked her, and I realized something. I wasn't the first, but I was going to be the last. I created a folder on my laptop. I labeled it documentation. Inside, I saved everything. The emails from Richard to the wedding planner, screenshots of Lauren's messages, the timeline of the wedding day, the names of everyone who witnessed the interruption. The contract showing Richard had no legal authority. I printed copies. I saved them to a cloud drive. I sent copies to Maya with instructions to keep them safe. This wasn't about revenge. This was about protection, because I knew Richard. Men like him don't stop. They escalate. If I married Daniel without addressing this, Richard would spend the rest of my life undermining me. He'd question every decision. He'd control every milestone. He'd make sure I never forgot that he thought I wasn't good enough. So I wasn't just defending my wedding. I was defending my future. And I wasn't going to do it by yelling. I was going to do it with facts. Daniel started seeing it. Slowly, painfully. I didn't push. I just asked questions. Why do you think your father pays for everything? Why do you think he needs to approve your decisions? Do you think he'll stop after we're married? At first, Daniel defended him. He's just trying to help. But the more we talked, the more cracks appeared. One night, Daniel said, I think I've been scared of him my whole life. I didn't say, I know. I just held his hand. What do you want to do about it? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw clarity. I want to marry you without him controlling it. Then we need to set boundaries. He won't accept boundaries. I smiled. He doesn't have to accept them, he just has to follow them. Daniel looked terrified, but he nodded, and I knew he was finally waking up. Richard tried again. This time he didn't come to me. He sent an email. Subject line, final warning. The email was polite but firm. He said he'd consulted with lawyers. He said if I pursued this wedding, he'd consider it an act of manipulation. He said he had evidence that I was using Daniel for financial gain. He said he'd protect his son at all costs. It was a threat, wrapped in legal-sounding language, designed to scare me. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my old boss, Margaret. She called me within 10 minutes. This is a bluff. He has no case, but he's testing you. If you respond emotionally, he wins. If you don't respond at all, you win. What do I do? Nothing. Let him sit in his own silence and keep documenting. So I didn't respond. I saved the email, and I waited. The silence was strategic. Richard expected me to argue, to defend myself, to beg. When I didn't, he got louder. He called Daniel. He called the venue. He called the vendors. But here's the thing. None of them needed his approval, because his name wasn't on the contracts. The florist politely told him they couldn't discuss the event without the contract holder's permission. The photographer did the same. Even the venue coordinator, who had witnessed his outburst, started deferring to me and Daniel. Richard was losing control, and he couldn't understand why. Because he'd spent his whole life believing money was power. But contracts are power. And I had the contracts. I didn't gloat. I didn't send him an email explaining this. I just let the process move forward. And every time he hit a wall, I knew he was getting more desperate. Then something unexpected happened. The venue owner, Patricia, called me. Rosie, I need to let you know something. Richard requested a meeting with me. He wanted to discuss canceling your event and implied there were safety concerns. My stomach dropped. Safety concerns? He said you were unstable, that the wedding was a risk. I told him I couldn't discuss it without documentation and that I'd need to involve our legal team if he continued making claims like that. I took a deep breath. What happens now? Our legal team is reviewing the situation. If he's making false claims to interfere with a contracted event, that's a problem for him. I thanked her, and I realized something. Richard had overplayed his hand. He'd gone from controlling father to potential legal liability. And businesses don't protect people who create liability. They protect themselves. The cracks started showing. Richard's calls to vendors stopped getting returned. His emails went unanswered. The people he thought he could intimidate with money and reputation started stepping back, because they didn't want to be involved in whatever this was. Daniel told me his father was furious. He keeps saying people are disrespecting him. He doesn't understand why no one is listening. I didn't say what I was thinking. That respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And Richard had spent so much time controlling people that he'd forgotten how to treat them like humans. Instead, I said, maybe he's realizing that control isn't the same as respect. Daniel nodded slowly. I think you're right. And I could see it. The shift. Daniel was starting to see his father clearly, not as a protector, as a problem. Patricia called again. I wanted to give you a heads up. Our legal team reviewed Richard's claims. They found them baseless and potentially defamatory. We've sent him a formal letter indicating that any further interference with your contracted event will result in legal action. I felt my chest unclench for the first time in weeks. Thank you. You didn't deserve what he did. And for what it's worth, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen a lot of difficult family dynamics. But I've never seen someone handle it the way you did. You stayed calm. You didn't make it worse. You just stood your ground. I hung up and sat on my couch. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just felt the weight start to lift, because Richard wasn't untouchable. He was just loud. And loud doesn't win when the facts aren't on your side. Daniel and I set a new date. Smaller venue, fewer guests, only the people who mattered, no grand gestures, no expensive decorations, just us, and the people who actually loved us. Richard wasn't invited. Daniel told him over the phone. I didn't hear the conversation, but I heard Daniel's voice afterward, shaky but firm. I told him he's not coming. How did he react? He said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this, that I was choosing you over family. What did you say? I said I was choosing my future over his control. I hugged him, and I realized something. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Daniel was finally standing up, not because I forced him, because he was ready. The ceremony was quiet, beautiful. My mother cried. Maya stood beside me. Daniel's younger sister came, even though Richard had told her not to. She hugged me afterward and whispered, I'm proud of you both. There was no drama, no interruptions, no last-minute speeches, just vows, just love, just the life we were choosing. Afterward, we received an envelope, no return address. Inside was a letter from the venue's legal team. It was brief, professional. It stated that Richard had been formally warned about his conduct and that any further interference would result in legal consequences. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. His behavior was now documented, officially, and that documentation would follow him, not because I chased revenge, but because he'd created it himself. Over the next few months, I heard things, through Daniel, through mutual acquaintances. Richard had tried to repair his reputation. He told people I'd manipulated the situation, that he was just trying to protect his son. But people had questions. They'd heard about the legal letter. They'd heard about the vendors refusing to work with him. They'd heard that his own son hadn't invited him to the wedding. And slowly, quietly, his credibility eroded, not because I destroyed it. Because he'd destroyed it himself, by being cruel, by being controlling, by assuming no one would push back. He lost exactly what he'd weaponized against me, his authority, his reputation, his control, and I didn't have to do anything but stand my ground. Daniel and I moved into a small house an hour away from his family. We built a life. Quiet, intentional, mine. I went back to work. I got a promotion. I stopped looking over my shoulder. Richard tried to reach out once, an email, subject line, "Can we talk?" I showed it to Daniel. He said, "Do you want to respond?" I thought about it, about everything he put me through, about the humiliation, the fear, the nights I couldn't sleep. And then I thought about where I was now, married, happy, free. "No," I said, "he doesn't get access anymore." Daniel nodded, and we deleted the email. There was no closure call, no apology tour, no final confrontation, just silence where his power used to be, and a life that finally felt like mine. Looking back, I realized something. The people who try to humiliate you publicly are hoping you'll respond privately. They want you to beg, to cry, to prove you're weak. But strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's documentation. It's knowing your rights. It's refusing to give them the reaction they need to justify their cruelty. Richard thought he could control me because he'd controlled everyone else, but I wasn't everyone else. I was someone who knew how power actually works. And I used that knowledge not to destroy him, but to protect myself. In the end, he didn't lose because I fought dirty. He lost because I fought smart. And that's a lesson I'll carry forever. Some battles aren't won with noise. They're won with silence, patience, and receipts. What would you do in this situation? Have you ever dealt with someone who tried to control or humiliate you? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're from and how you'd handle this. I'd love to hear your stories. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this coming, and I don't want you to miss them. Thanks for being here. It means everything.